Welcome to day 163 on the trail. We have three readings for today. From 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 25 through 8:13, Joshua 19 verse 40 through 21 verse 45, and 2 Maccabees chapter 3 verse 22 through 34. Today, we will focus our time on 1 Corinthians chapter 8, since there are several very important themes for us to explore. As 1 Corinthians 8 opens, Paul addresses a question that appears to have been raised concerning food that has been sacrificed to idols, specifically meat. Due to its cost, eating meat was generally not an ordinary practice in the first century. And for those who could afford to eat meat, the most accessible source was often connected to pagan temples. Now, this created a problem for those who had become Christians. On the one hand, if the meat sold in the markets was connected to idolatry and pagan practices, it would seem that followers of Jesus should avoid it. On the other hand, however, this would further separate Christians from their cities and communities in which they lived, and could also create divisions with family and friends. As we have seen throughout 1 Corinthians, Paul is addressing questions from the church in Corinth relating to separation from the world and assimilation to it. Where should these boundaries between the world and life in the kingdom be drawn? On one side of the debate, there are Christians whom Paul labels as strong. They claimed that since idols were not real, then the meat sacrificed to these non-entities could be eaten without harm. In the end, it was simply meat. On the other side of the debate were those Paul called the weak, those who saw eating meat sacrificed to idols as a form of collusion with idolatry. The question that Paul addresses, however, goes a step deeper. Beneath the decision whether or not to eat meat that had been sacrificed to a pagan idol was the practice of Christian community. How would Christians who disagree on a particular topic or believe differently live together in unity amid their diversity? In 1 Corinthians chapter 8 verses 1 through 3, Paul writes, "Now concerning food sacrificed to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Anyone who claims to know something does not yet have the necessary knowledge, but anyone who loves God is known by him." Immediately, Paul moves from the immediate situation at hand, namely food sacrificed to idols, to the underlying issue. At the heart of this debate is the distinction between knowledge that puffs up, or knowledge that leads to boasting, and love that builds up. For Paul, knowing the correct information without being sensitive to the needs of one's community is useless. In verses 4 through 6, Paul writes that he agrees with the perspective of the strong. In verse 4 specifically, Paul points out this: "We know that no idol in the world really exists, and that there is no God but one. God alone is the one and only ultimate power in the universe, and idols are nothing but human creations." However, there appear to be others in the Corinthian church who, having been surrounded by idolatry for so long, they are struggling with their new identity. As a result, their conscience is troubled. And for Paul, our conscience is a significant part of our moral reasoning. Therefore, if someone in the church believes that eating meat sacrificed to idols somehow connects them to pagan practices or wounds their conscience, then for them, eating such meat is wrong. But how does this affect the strong? According to Paul, what we eat or drink is not the fundamental problem. From 1 Corinthians chapter 8, beginning in verse 8, "Food will not bring us close to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Just because the strong possess the knowledge that the meat sacrificed to idols will not defile a person because the idols do not really exist, this does not mean that they can use this knowledge to cause the conscience of the weak to suffer. That is, the freedom of the strong should not be used to place a stumbling block in the way of their brothers and sisters. After all, Christ died for both the strong and the weak. As Paul writes in chapter 8, verses 11 through 13, "So by your knowledge, those weak believers for whom Christ died are destroyed. But when you thus sin against members of your family and wound their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food is a cause of their falling, I will never eat meat, so that I may not cause one of them to fall." As a general principle for Paul, the strong must limit their freedom for the sake of others. This pattern of willingly sacrificing a position of strength for one of weakness is the great exchange that Jesus made for us on the cross. One final point from our reading today. Back on day 134, we discussed the Shema from Deuteronomy chapter 6. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might." In Judaism, the Shema is the definitive declaration of Jewish monotheism, or the existence of only one true God. The Shema is recited during the daily morning and evening prayers and is considered one of the most essential prayers in all of Judaism. So here in 1 Corinthians 8, we can see how Paul brilliantly blends Jesus into the Shema. Now recall that Paul was a Pharisee and therefore wholly dedicated to the Shema. But look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 from our reading today, especially verse 6. "Hence, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that no idol in the world really exists, and that there is no God but one. Indeed, even though there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as in fact there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist." Paul clearly starts with the Shema. There is no God but one, and there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist. But then Paul quickly adds, "and one Lord, Jesus, through whom are all things and through whom we exist." Now here's where Paul gets very creative. Earlier along the trail, we discussed how the Jewish people handled God's name, Yahweh. Instead of saying the name, they replaced it with Adonai, which meant my Lord. So we can see what Paul is actually doing here in 1 Corinthians. Paul is saying, we have one God, the Father, and one Lord, Adonai, Yahweh, the great I am, Jesus. Also, as we saw throughout John's Gospel, Jesus repeatedly refers to himself as I am, thereby making this same connection. Since there is one God, we have one ultimate authority that we call upon in prayer. There is no higher authority. There are no competing interests. We have one judge who sees the world clearly. We have a single point of contact, a single anchor in the storms of life. And Jesus, who came to this world and walked among us, is the fullest expression of the living God. He was, and is, and always will be God with us. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.